Hi, and thanks for joining us for the difference between next generation science standards and the Common Core state standards for ELA and math. My name is Francis Vigent. I'm a co-founder here at KnowAtom and a former teacher. I function as a CEO. And just to give you a quick bit of background on KnowAtom, KnowAtom is an organization that's really been involved in translating the next generation science standards into curriculum and materials and professional development that help classrooms and specifically really teachers and their schools meet the needs of the next generation science standards in a real actionable way. The reason that we exist, maybe perhaps what makes us so unique, is the idea that science, technology, engineering, and math is really the best avenue to teach critical thinking skills, and specifically those thinking skills around creativity, analysis, and evaluation. And so when you think about putting students in the role of scientist and engineer, the way the next generation science standards really frames science and education in the classroom, that's where we're helping schools and districts. And of course, that's how you arrive at the actual materials required. But today's webinar, I'd like to really talk about the difference between the next generation science standards, but also kind of how these processes work and how this sort of is an evolution. Because the next generation science standards didn't sort of crop out of nowhere. They've been in process for quite some time. And the same is true for the Common Core state standards. So the question really at the base of all of this is, are the next generation science standards likely to be received or become in many ways the common core of science? And so I'd like to kind of think of this from a teacher and administrator's perspective, really try to think about it from a classroom perspective as we go through three key areas. One, the similarity and differences between next generation science standards and the Common Core state standards, where next generation science standards are likely to spark debate, and as an administrator, as a teacher, how you can avoid sort of the next generation science standard showdown in your school or district, sort of the tensions that we've seen sort of rise around Common Core state standards. I'll let you know, if you're on the live session, if you look on the right side of your screen, you'll see a question box. You're welcome to ask questions. I'm going to try and save about 15 minutes towards the end so that we can go through those questions. I'll get to as many as I can. There are a number of folks here on this webinar, and it's a hot topic. If I am unable to get to your question, I'll give you my contact information at the end, and please feel free to reach out. So let's jump in. I think the first place we really want to look is the origin and process and language of these two sort of different processes. So the first process being Common Core state standards. So Common Core state standards emerged out of two groups, one being the National Governors Association, and the second group being the Chief State School Officers, or the Council of Chief State School Officers. Both of these groups are, in essence, advocacy groups. You can see here, and I highlighted for you, when you look at the National Governors Association, it's the collective voice of the nation's governors, specifically governors who support the principles of federalism. So typically federalism being sort of a different view from states' rights and sort of a local control model, more of a central control model is what we think of and think of federalism. And providing governors who are part of this association services that range from representation on Capitol Hill, which you see down here in the middle, and before the administration, and the administration being the White House. And what they specifically do, you see down in the bottom here, deal collectively with matters of public policy and governance. So if you think about a governor engaged in the National Governors Association, essentially this is a place where governors can go to try and bring issues that are sort of important to them in their state to the table in such a way that they can get other governors on board. And this is sort of the vehicle to do that. And so you can imagine the idea of Common Core state standards being something that is a federal sort of principle, this idea of everyone with the same standards, why there's an interest here. The second group that I mentioned, this Council of Chief State School Officers, is another kind of similar group, but the membership here is what they call Chief State School Officers, or really the heads of the Departments of Education in various states. And so what I wanted to point out here is that really what's happening is this group is an opportunity for the state sort of heads of education to find a similar friend, and sort of build a coalition among other state heads of education. And so that's why you see things like these leadership academies where this group, the CCSSO, will help these state folks to find support, but also help their leadership team to kind of push policy at a higher level than they may be able to do within their own state. And the focus being K-12 programming. And there's talk here about sort of the connection between business and industry. And you can go through, and I would recommend, if you're interested to sort of see the groups up close, to visit the websites of these two organizations and see who's involved, and also in the case of the CCSSO, kind of when they talk about industry, who they're really talking about. The industry partners that they list are more education industry partners than industry partners in the sense of the businesses who are employing students or relying on math and ELA skills. And this is going to be one of the key areas of difference that I'm going to talk about in a little bit in terms of sort of the difference in where these next generation science standards are coming from versus where the Common Core standards came from. So the Common Core standards for ELA and math came from basically two advocacy groups and those who support them and are part of their partnerships. And that's how we arrive at the Common Core state standards, because basically those two groups had the funding and the political support in order to bring this together. Achieve is an organization you may be aware of. Achieve sort of spun out of that, or was started by the National Governors Association around like late 90s, early 2000s, after that accountability movement sort of had gotten root, and Achieve sort of became the organization that developed this first set of common standards, and that was the Common Core ELA and math. And what's kind of interesting, I think, to point out here is the Common Core state standards, in many ways, ELA and math were the first children. With the next generation science standards, you essentially have the third child. There's a number of differences that you'll see even in the language of the way I think that lessons have been learned perhaps the hard way here. And you'll see, and this is 2015, just a screenshot from the Common Core Standards website, you can see the language is still sort of hinting at tension. You can see I highlighted here actual standards, that this website's providing educators, policymakers, journalists, and others easy access to the actual standards, as well as supporting information. And then a little further down, Common Core is a set of high-quality academic standards in mathematics and English language arts. So there's sort of this, a little bit of a tone, and if you kind of go through all the material, that there's a sense of being on the defensive here, and there's also yet a kind of a vision, which you see down the bottom. For years, the academic progress of our nation's students has been stagnant. We've lost ground to our international peers, particularly in subjects as math. College remediation rates have been high, and so on. I'm not saying that any of this is not factual, but it definitely has a specific point of view about our nation's progress and the need for these standards, and yet is somewhat on the defensive about the quality of the standards and the fact that, there's some issue between what the standards are and are not when we see them kind of put forward as actual standards. So the Common Core process really kind of got to this point. So this is where it is now. And the Common Core state standards, everything aside, really, I think, try to do some important and good things. I think that most of the issues that we've seen really come from how communities often learned about the Common Core state standards for ELA and math. When you kind of look at the process, this is sort of how it unfolded. So the Council of Chief School Officers, the CCSSO, were the ones that were really operationally making it happen to get the Common Core standards up and running. And then what happened was their message, and through Achieve and so on, filtered down into a state message, and then the state filtered that out to superintendents as the states decided whether or not they would adopt. And so once they did that, and again the federal government was sort of playing a role here, incentivizing states to adopt through federal funding, the superintendents would then sort of form an opinion, take their reflection and how they were going to implement it in their district, and then put that on to principals who would then interface with teachers. So you can see that we sort of have this trickle-down effect. The problem with this is that the Common Core state standards, it's like a giant game of telephone. By the time they reach superintendents and principals and ultimately teachers, the message is muddled. And so this communication process really was probably the #1 reason that Common Core state standards had so much trouble. When you think about the resources that are being used in classrooms, the resources might be informed by the state's message. They might be informed by the actual standards themselves. But they ultimately come down to what either the superintendent decides to buy or the principal decides to buy, which a teacher has to use. And so the disconnection between resources and the actual sort of source of the standards and what people's local level, sort of the superintendent principal level opinions were, thoughts were, was really what the resources came to reflect over time. And unfortunately, there's a lot of unscrupulous, and that sounds maybe a little harsh, but unscrupulous resource providers that would call their materials Common Core or Common Core aligned, and from very, very large publishing companies, some who were involved in actually funding the Common Core state standards, and that resource base really became people's impression of what Common Core was. And I'll give you an example of that in a concrete sense. So this is from a fairly famous article in the National Review from March 2014, where the National Review published a number of Common Core questions that would, I think the title was Questions Guaranteed to Make Your Brain Hurt. And so this was one of the questions, and this was from New York State. So the NYS Common Core math curriculum, and you can see the question: use number bonds to help you skip count by 7 by making 10 or adding to the ones. And I'm not sure what that means, and I'm a fairly well-educated person. I think most folks are probably asking the same question, and that's what this article brought forward. What's interesting, though, is that number bonds does not appear in the Common Core standards. And skip counting, when you put it into the context of the standard, which I have put below here, count within the 1,000, skip count by 5s, 10s, and 100s. So to count by 5s, to count by 10s, to count by 100s is the idea of skip counting. This question is not from the Common Core. It's just a question that the NYS Common Core math curriculum, whoever made that, thought was appropriate, and somebody adopted that. So you can see, we're just going to back up 1 second, that when a resource doesn't accurately reflect the standard and somebody chooses to adopt that, whether it's at the state level, the superintendent level, the principal level, it negatively impacts teachers and also students, because a student was sort of, they were faced with this question. Not sort of, they were. So it's not particularly fair to the students, so they have a negative impact. And of course, then parents will look at work coming home and say, my goodness, you know, how does this make any sense? It doesn't make sense to me as a grown adult. With my background, how's it going to make sense to my first grader? And then this plays out over and over and over again. So the result of the poor communication, that sort of chain from the folks developing the Common Core state standards and the actual teachers and students and so on, resulted in not only poor implementation, which is what I would call this, but it also results in public outcry. And this is another example. And what's interesting is that this example, and if I'm not going to say the name, but perhaps you can decipher it from the bottom, this example was made by a major publisher, multi-billion-dollar publisher, and you can see here this question number 1, find the missing part for exercises 1 and 2. The part I know, the whole, there's really not even a question here. It's unfortunately just a poor resource. Comes back to the earlier point about communication flow. How did this resource ever get in front of a child? How did this resource ever end up purchased by a state or a district or a school? Who knows? But this is the actual standard on the left. Determine the unknown whole number in an addition or subtraction equation relating 3 whole numbers. For example, determine the unknown number that makes the equation true in each of the equations. 8 plus something equals 11. Okay, so you can see there's no context here. So I'm bringing this up because Common Core state standards, as the first and second child, had sort of all these mistakes happen in such a way and in such a magnitude that the lack of communication actually hit national media. And that's where I'm pulling these examples from. The National Review, you can, if you haven't experienced it in your own district, you can go online and experience via YouTube or 100 other or thousands of other sources how this works in terms of people being upset about poor quality resources in the classroom. So just highlighting here, the next sort of way this unfolds is not only in the resources in the classroom or perhaps even the resources that are being developed by teachers or curriculum directors, but in the disconnect between the resources and the testing. So what tends to happen now, and we've seen this sort of play out with PARCC and Smarter Balance, other assessments that have emerged around Common Core, is the idea that the test providers have a vision or a mode of testing which is supposed to align directly with the standards, and what's happening in the classroom may or may not reflect that because it's a function of the state's message, the superintendent's message, the principal's message, and also really the local level decision making in terms of what resources are purchased. And so if a district adopts a resource like we just looked at a moment ago, that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense. People are doing it because they're told to. They're not necessarily building the children are not building the necessary skills. And so what happens is when it comes test time, the test registers low student performance on these new standards. Well, why is that? It can be for any number of reasons. It can certainly be related to the formatting of the test itself, which is one of the mistakes I think that was made, particularly around PARCC, where we hear about all of the computer trouble in the media and elsewhere. Perhaps you've seen it in your own classroom or school. So moving forward, these are things that we have to wonder, are they going to be part of the next generation science standards sort of rollout and adoption? And I would say maybe. And I'm going to explain why maybe. So what we've seen so far with the next generation science standards is a good deal of learning. So the next generation science standards are being developed by Achieve, or have been developed by Achieve. One of the key distinctions, which I'm going to go into further in a moment, is that the next generation science standards are not coming out of policymakers and sort of the clubs of policymakers, but really coming out of the National Academies of Science and Engineering, the National Institute of Health, the Carnegie Corporation, So folks who are very experienced in innovation and really see a legitimate need for these new standards and are asking really attuned questions. So as those standards have emerged, the messaging has been going through the states, and so some states have taken a look at the next generation science standards and adopted them wholesale, so they are what they are. Others have made some tweaks, basically just changing the name in a lot of cases. And so that state message starts to trickle down in the same way we saw with Common Core state standards. It goes from the state to the superintendent, principals, and so on. What's interesting is that there's a much better set of resources that, and also outreach to curriculum providers. And so the next generation science standards, there's really no excuse for curriculum to not reflect the standards. And so that's why you see this other arrow sort of from the next generation science standards down here to resources. Now here's where it gets a little tricky. What a resource provider chooses to do with that information, whether they even seek it out, how they implement it, is anybody's guess. A lot of what we've seen so far is textbooks and kits, which basically are the same as they were under the old standards, with some mild changes, maybe a hands-on activity, a little make-by-number booklet put with it. Now it's being called Next Generation, and it's being put out there. And so the question becomes, do the superintendents and principals buy this curriculum? Do they buy these resources? Is that what they put into their classrooms? Because if they do, that's where it affects teachers. How well do the superintendents and how well do the principals understand the next generation science standards through what they've heard from the state and perhaps achieve next generation science standards? Because that's what's going to impact their teacher, that's what's going to be reflected in the classroom, and that's what's going to impact students. Now the testing, there's not much known about the testing at this point in terms of what the official next generation science standard assessments will look like. However, there are a lot of inquiry models of assessment. Places like Ohio already have sort of next generation assessments developed and in place or in rollout. The next generation of science assessment is going to be performance-based assessment. It's going to have a lot of sort of look and feel of the PARCC assessments in terms of looking at or requiring students to demonstrate performance expectations. We just don't have the literal test yet. You can look to things like the OECD's PISA assessment and you get a really good sense of what performance expectations look like in terms of having students engage in a context and have to apply practices and skills to develop an answer from that text. But depending on what happens in the classroom, students will or will not be ready to meet that expectation. And so it's still a process that could go awry in a number of communities. The big question really comes down to what happens between the state, the superintendent, and the principal. How discerning are they as educators? There are states that are more discerning about the level of standards that they require. That's why there are such large performance disparities when you look at national testing, even in ELA and in math. Different states have different standards, and so measured all together, there's wide gaps. If you look at some of the lowest level states, by their own measures, they're doing okay. It's a question of discernment. The other question is, how attuned are they with the purpose and really spirit of next generation science standards? How well are they versed in what the three dimensions are, what this environment will look like, the difference, and this is huge, the difference between curriculum and standards. So this sort of green box is really where the battle is won or lost, because superintendents and principals who are not attuned and aren't particularly discerning are not going to develop their own resources or adopt resources which reflect the next generation science standards as they're intended. If a state doesn't budget for it or a superintendent doesn't budget for it, that's going to be difficult. And so outside of that, the resources and the effectiveness in the classroom is going to be impacted, and then of course students testing and parents will have to reflect on that. There's, I would say, less, as the third child here, there's less bite in the next generation science standards because federal funding and accountability is not as closely tied as it was with the Common Core ELA and the Common Core math standards. However, more and more we're seeing states who are states who have standardized testing, tying the results of that standardized testing in science to district accountability measures and some state funding formulas. And, you know, it goes both ways. It's a good thing because science is the perfect opportunity to teach critical thinking skills. Students need to be able to create, evaluate, and analyze in a scientific sense, whether they're salespeople, whether they're plumbers, whether they are marketing people, lawyers, or whether they choose to go on to be scientists or engineers. So it's really an issue of career readiness, whatever that career is. And if a student decides to go on to college, of course, these are prerequisite skills to be able to function in a college environment. That said, it's important to kind of think about what or where these standards came from. So I would say hold this in the back of your mind, you know, the level of sort of understanding. Do the superintendents, do the states, do the principals invest time to understand what this is all about and what it looks like in the classroom and what appropriate resources look like and what resources claim to be appropriate, yet they aren't, and what, you know, which those are. So the next generation science standards started really in the early 2000s, and even you might say a little bit before that, with a report that was published by the Carnegie Corporation. And so the Carnegie Corporation's report, I believe it was around 2004, so it was sort of the culminating report, which was called the Opportunity Equation. And I'll read this to you. It's just a quick bit from the foreword of this report, but the focus of the report was really looking at mathematics and science education as an engine for democracy, and really thinking about not only innovation, or not only our global competitiveness sort of ideas, but really innovation and how education can help to inspire innovation and to prepare innovators, the next generation of innovators. So what it says here, and I'll just read it for you quickly, literally out of the Carnegie Corporation's Opportunity Equation. In the post-Cold War of the 21st century, when we have entered into a new phase of globalization characterized by knowledge-based economies and fierce competition, the United States can no longer afford not to be fully engaged with math and science and their application to teaching and learning. It was with that spirit, in 2007, the Carnegie Corporation of New York joined with the Institute for Advanced Study to create a commission comprised of some of our nation's most distinguished mathematicians, scientists, educators, scholars, business leaders, and public officials to assess not only the current state of math and science education in the U.S., but also how to enhance the capacity for our schools and universities to generate innovative strategies across all fields that will increase access to high-quality education for every student in every classroom. If we believe, as the great education reformer Horace Mann did, that education is the engine of democracy, then the strength and progress of both American society and our democracy depend on our ability to mobilize around this work with clear goals and great determination. So the reason I read that to you is that this is really the point at which the next generation science standards are born or even conceived. And the group of individuals who are coming together around this were not policymakers or solely policymakers. They were not solely educators. This was not sort of the product of a couple of interest groups saying, you know, we could benefit from something that is, you know, shared amongst everybody. but it was really something that came out of industry, STEM industry, the people who are innovating, the people who are part of the National Academies of Science and Engineering and the National Institute of Health. And so that's how the opportunity equation sparks an interest by the National Research Council, which is the sort of staff side of the National Academies of Science and Engineering, and ultimately bring about the next generation science standards as a result of the report, Successful K-12 STEM Education, where the National Research Council actually went out and said, okay, you know, there are all of these reports, Rising Above the Gathering Storm, Tough Choices or Tough Times, the Opportunity Equation. Let's really look into what's happening in our nation's classrooms. Let's see what students can do, and let's see if we can learn from that, use it as a model, and develop some standards around it. So that's what this report, Successful K-12 STEM Education, was all about. And these are all free, by the way. You can go online, just Google the name Successful K-12 STEM Education, and you can download the report for free. And I'd recommend you do it because it really helps bridge the gap between, and this is a free report as well, the Opportunity Equation. It will bridge the gap for you in terms of where did all this come from. Okay, and that's going to be key in really understanding these next generation science centers, is understanding where they came from. They came from scientists and engineers. They came from companies that rely on innovation, that produce innovation, and so, and really crying out. It wasn't so much that they said we need new standards. They said we need people who we can employ. We need kids who are ready to take on science and engineering degrees. It's not happening. Why? And so there's this sort of shadow of the practitioners over this whole process, which has been very beneficial, I think. And I think that it's actually one of the problems with Common Core state ELA and math standards was that, you know, there was community involvement, but it was not something that was driven by the guild of top-selling authors and journalists. It's not, you know, something that was driven by the mathematicians, you know, society of XYZ. The Common Core state standards was much more of a political process than the next generation science standards have been in terms of their origin. There's been quite a political process in terms of how they were developed and rolled out. But that's why we see a lot of different language here. So far, 15 states and territories, among states and territories, District of Columbia, so on, have adopted the next generation science standards. There are 40 states and territories in total who have expressed strong interest in adopting them, and 26 states were involved in their development. But when you even look at the website for the next generation science standards, you see very different language. Something that's much more true to the spirit of science and engineering than what we saw in that sort of tense language on the Common Core site. You see here, you know, quality science education is based on standards that are rich in content and practice. It's very sort of factual. It's not emotionally charged, and I think that really the involvement of, like I say here, major advances in science and so on, that spurred the need for update really came at a great time. I think by being sort of third in line, it really does reflect a lot of learning around communication and messaging, but also the need for people who are really innovators. If people want to create innovative science and engineering standards and they don't involve innovators, or it's not really pushed by innovators, we're in trouble. So the next generation science standards are really in the spirit of Common Core. You know, Common Core says that they do this too, but next generation science standards are really aimed at higher order thinking skills like creating, evaluating, and analyzing. And so the way that we can view them is really where those higher order thinking skills happen simultaneously. And I think that that's true of the Common Core ELA and math standards. I think the problem is that not too many people got that message, and unfortunately where they've gotten their message is not really from the standards themselves, but somebody else's articulation or reflection of them. And so that's important to point out. For next generation science in particular, we have something called science and engineering practices. So again, these are very skills-oriented standards. They're actually performance expectations and not fact-related standards. For next generation science standards, you see that the practices come all the way from 2012 in the National Research Council framework, where at a high level, these are the skills that students need to be developing as a result of science and engineering in their classroom. And oftentimes we're not happening under the previous standards, so asking questions or defining problems, not only using a model but developing it, not only carrying out an investigation but planning it, arguing from evidence, constructing explanations. All these pieces are part of the next generation science standards, not necessarily the standards that were in place in your state previously. And that's going to be a shift for folks. The next generation science standards give a great context for literacy, both for math and ELA. There are Common Core standards which now can play out in the context of science. For instance, using text to support, or using textual evidence to support analysis of science, summarizing distinct from prior knowledge, expressing information visually, distinguishing among facts and judgment based on research findings. This is next generation science standards in the classroom, if they're properly reflected in curriculum, are the place where these ELA Common Core technical subject standards can play out, and there's more than I have here, but I'm just trying to show you that if you are dealing with Common Core ELA, next generation science standards are a place for that, for a lot of those standards to come alive. But again, it takes really understanding Common Core ELA and making sure that your resources reflect that they're not some kind of, these other resources I showed you earlier, and then on top of it, understanding what that environment looks like. So on the math side, the same thing. The math practices are skills specific to math. Well, when we think of science and engineering, there's a lot of overlap. Science and engineering practices that I showed you earlier, those 8, are very closely related to these math practices, making sense of problems, reasoning abstractly, constructing a viable argument, using appropriate tools, attending to precision, and so on. Those are all parts of executing as a scientist or an engineer, sort of as a student, in that classroom, being in that role. And so resources and curriculum have to reflect this. If they don't, then basically you're not making use of your science time to achieve Common Core math goals. You may fall short on the ELA side as well, so kind of missed opportunities here. But if the resource doesn't reflect these practices, then it's not really a next generation resource, next generation science resource. And so that's the piece. So really, what I want to make sure that you take away from this is that by bringing science and engineering practices into next generation science standards and really making that a dimension, what we now have is a home for ELA and a home for math in this sort of classroom environment where students are scientists and engineers, where it's student-centered. There's no longer sort of this, fact memorization and recall model of instruction. I'm going to show you a little bit more about that in a second. So we've kind of gone through, okay, where did the standards come from? Sort of, a lot of gray areas, but when you look at the next generation science standards, what you can see specifically is that the scientists and engineers, really the preeminent scientists and engineers, the national academies, have had a great deal of influence. And they're actually people who are, by and large, outside of politics. They may participate and influence it, but they're not appointed by anybody. They are who they are. They have invented what they've invented, and so they're really quite something, special people. Where next generation science standards are likely to spark debate is really where this shift has occurred, and I want to kind of break that down here. It kind of falls into these 3 areas. One, what science, technology, engineering, and math is. That has shifted in a major way. The role of teachers, students, and content has shifted in a major way. And then this idea of what a standard is and what 3 dimensions are is something that's quite new to people. Under the next generation science standards, science and engineering has a real definition. Science is answering a question through the use of an experiment. By creating an experiment, you can test a hypothesis and you can gather data to reflect on whether that hypothesis is true or false, and you can form a data-based conclusion. That's how scientists develop scientific knowledge. Engineers use that scientific knowledge to solve problems. And so engineers identify problems, they use their scientific knowledge to solve them, and they do that by developing prototypes, testing those prototypes and gathering the data, and then using the data to decide whether that prototype should be refined or replicated. And if it's replicated, that's technology. Okay, could be a doorstop, could be a doorknob, could be a new type of plastic, or a computer program, or a process for quality control. All of these things are engineered. And there's a relationship between technology and all of these parts, because the technology helps scientists ask deeper questions and really answer them. Answer questions that they couldn't answer before, or raise new questions. And the role of math is to quantify and analyze and communicate, make things replicable. So it's very new for most folks to think of science and engineering and technology and math in a kind of cycle with these very close relationships. But in reality, this is how it works. And this is really a foundational shift for a lot of educators, because this is not how our schools of education teach teachers, or specifically science teachers, or elementary generalists or others, about science. They don't, the mode of instruction for science that everybody is taught really follows a traditional model. There's content out there, and as a teacher, you're the content expert, and students don't know what you know. So what you do is you demonstrate the phenomenon, you model the facts, and you explain what these ideas are. And students recall the facts or repeat the demonstration or summarize the phenomenon to show that they've learned. And that's a very, very traditional model. Now, in some states where inquiry standards have been present, there's more value placed on students developing skills to be able to uncover facts, to be able to ask questions and so on. So it has a lot of sort of it depends on what state we're talking about, but there's some look and feel to those inquiry standards which are closely related to the next generation science standards, and not this traditional model. But by and large, the orientation traditionally has been facts delivered through this model. With the next generation science standards, we have a new definition of effective STEM instruction, and this is it. And it's a movement from what you see on the left to what you see on the right, but yet there's issues with the messaging. The picture I take on the left is actually from the National Research Council's own documentation. And so there is mixed messaging happening here. If you even go to photo stock and you try to look at pictures of science, science class, there's some beakers and maybe some bubbling stuff and kids looking excited, or some formulas on the board and a teacher lecturing. This is sort of our society's picture of what science education is. The definition, though, and really the inspiration, is what you see in text here, and which really points at what you see on the right, which is a picture I took in one of our classrooms. Effective STEM instruction capitalizes on, and I'm reading the definition, students' early interest in experiences. It identifies and builds on what they know and provides them with experiences to engage the students in the practices of science and sustain their interest. So just to unpack that for a second, that effective STEM instruction starts early. It's pre-K on up, okay? It identifies and builds on what they know. It's intentionally nurturing. It's scaffolding. And it provides students with experiences to engage them in the practices. And by practices, we mean those 8 things we were talking about, those skills specific to science and engineering. In such a way, it sustains students' interest. So what you see on the left, and the reason I say that that's really a miscommunication, is that what you see on the left is that traditional model. A teacher pre-teaching, modeling, demonstrating, and then students go out and they repeat that. The teacher is the one engaged here in the practices. What you see on the right is students who are in the role of scientist and engineer. Their class has identified a problem. It fits in sort of a sequence, September through June. They're pulling on what they know not only from prior years, but from prior units in the same year. And this is an experience which is engaging them in that role of scientist and engineer, so they have to engage the practices. And in fact, there's even something else that doesn't get talked about, the process, the engineering design process or the scientific process. And not to say that science or engineering is linear, but there's actually a logical way or some rules of logic that we can use to go from a question to a conclusion in the development of an experiment and collection of data in the context of science. And then when it comes to engineering, sort of the identification of a problem and consideration of resources, designing of prototypes, and so on. So what you see on the right, the students, they're working together as a pair. They're in that driver's seat. What they're doing is original to their team. Somebody else in the class, another team, may have the same approach. They may not. Who knows? But for them, it's original, and it's their thinking. And as a result, they are engaged in building a framework of understanding, taking their ideas, engaging the practices, and then using that to collect data and then reflect back on their ideas. So it's much, much more student-centered, and it really changes the way that science instruction happens when you think about putting students in this role of scientist or engineer. So that kind of next-generation model of instruction is really about students developing science and engineering practice skills. And as students develop those skills, really internalize them, they're using them to access, to develop and use the content and really understand what's called the cross-cutting concepts or the system behavior, how content interacts with other content. And so the teacher's role is not to be the one who delivers content, but to be one who sort of tunes this inquiry environment, because it really is an environment for inquiry. So they have to adjust supports, they have to help students understand how to engage appropriately, they redirect and monitor, and the strategies that they're employing are not to remove the student from the role of scientist or engineer or to, remove engaging with a practice or application of a skill, but rather to help students develop those. On the student side, they are the ones who have to step into the role. So to function appropriately in this next generation environment, students have to develop and use the content. They have to use their skills to answer questions and solve problems. They also have to be able to describe and analyze and evaluate contexts based on how content interacts. And so that's very, very different. It's not simply giving back what was shown and not simply recalling facts or phenomena. It's not enough. It's lower order thinking. And so this focus is really on higher order thinking, which is why when you look at the next generation science standards, they've been developed this way, that the standard itself is a performance expectation that you see in white up the top here, and why it says clearly students who demonstrate understanding, and you can insert as a result of instruction, as a result of their classroom, can, and they can do this now, develop a model to describe the movement of matter among plants, animals, decomposers in the environment. Great. That needs a context. And so in order to get that context, we have the three dimensions. The orange being the content, and the content that's chosen here is content that connects with other content. It's not sort of isolated facts. On the left, you have in blue science and engineering practices, so that's the skills. And on the right in green, you have the sort of behavior of this content, which students should be able to identify. So there's a difference between the standards, which we see on the screen right now, and curriculum. Curriculum has to create a classroom environment which gives context for students to develop the skills to interact and develop and use the content and to discover the cross-cutting concepts. And by doing so, They are developing an understanding of the standard and really practicing the performance expectation. So there's really, while the context is open for interpretation, whether you choose marine ecosystems or the Arctic tundra or so on, that's up to you. But the students should be at a level of mastery such that they should be able to look at a marine ecosystem and look at a tundra, Arctic tundra, and be able to see the similarities and differences, because that's what real mastery is about at this point. And so that's why when you look at that next generation sort of model of instruction in the classroom, what you see is students accessing content through their practice skills. Okay, they're developing and using the content to create models and gather data and so on. And the thing is that you don't need fancy labs. You don't need black tables and gas coming through and hoods and all this sort of stuff, even in middle school, because as you see here, this is a picture I like to use from some of our work in the Kurdish region of northern Iraq. These children have fled everything. They've fled and left everything behind, and they're learning in UN HCR schools, in IDP camps, and yet we're able to engage them in those 3 dimensions, in that type of learning. They can learn those performance expectations with simple hands-on context, but it has to be thoughtful, it has to be articulated, and it has to give students enough ownership in that process so that they can go through and analyze, not only develop and plan, but actually analyze the results of their investigations and present those sort of results, evaluate claims, and so on. The reason I'm bringing this up is really so that you can think about your own experience in your own schools and districts, and really think about whether or not you're supported this way if you're a teacher, or if you're an administrator, whether you're supporting your teachers and your principals with this message, whether they understand that their classrooms can look like this. That you don't need the fancy tables, that in fact you need fancy thinking. And the fancy thinking really isn't that fancy. It's simply critical thinking. It's creating, evaluating, and analyzing with a purpose. And we have the next generation science standards really spelling out for us the flavor of that purpose, what that environment needs to include, and so the resources that we put in place should reflect that. That's really key here. And I know we're going a little bit longer than intended, so I'm going to just wrap up here, and I'll stick around for about 15 minutes. We have about 5 minutes left. So how to avoid a next generation science standards showdown in your school or district? Basically 3 things. Understand the design of next generation science standards and that they're performance expectations. This is not about recalling facts. Don't adopt a resource that's calling itself next generation aligned or next generation ready or whatever it is, despite the fact that it's from a giant company or not. Because that model of a fact-based standard instruction is not compatible with these next generation science standards. They're very much about higher order thinking and engaging your community in closed loop communication. So let's take a look at this. So 1, help your teams really think about the integration of areas. The things within next generation science standards that are really only science time on learning is the experimenting and prototyping. Everything else about these standards is getting at Common Core State Standards for math or Common Core State Standards for technical ELA. There's nonfiction reading, nonfiction writing, opportunities for data collection and graphing. That's the way we view it. If somebody chooses to, adopt a curriculum which has, other things, lots of make by number sort of stuff, then I think you're losing value there. By generating or by having a focus on creating, evaluating, and analyzing, we can really benefit all content areas. It's important that teachers and parents and everyone understand that the next generation science standards are a context for this, which benefits science instruction, but it also benefits ELA math, history, art, and all the other areas. So being very upfront and clear that these next generation science standards have creating, evaluating, and analyzing happening simultaneously. Because if educators go and try to isolate practices, it's a ridiculous approach. It's not going to work. If they try to approach practices without the scientific process or without the engineering design process, it's a ridiculous approach. Imagine a driver's test or going to driving school and sitting in a car and pressing the brake 10 times to learn how to stop in a parking lot. You just sit there and hit the brake 10 times and turn left. Or we'll just sit there and we'll turn the steering wheel to the left. Maybe we do that 10 times. That's not how you develop a skill. You need some basic understanding that the brake stops and the wheel turns, but then you need to scaffold up and actually use the brakes and the steering together, in a scaffolding environment. And so with next generation science standards, curriculum, the standards don't tell you how to do that. That's the role of curriculum. And so the curriculum has to be very thoughtfully created. I'm not going to go through curriculum here. If you want to see some next generation science units and readers, you're welcome to go to our website, KnowAtom.com. Look at the top, it says STEM curriculum. There's samples for grades 1 through 8 in there. You're welcome to take a look and see what that looks like in the moment, and then sort of think about how over time we're scaffolding that out for that exact purpose, because students have to develop the practices, and you can't develop a skill, which a practice is a skill, without doing it in a context. You can't just sit there and ask questions. You need to actually then take the question, develop a model, plan an investigation, and so on. And that really, the standards are fantastic because they lend themselves to that. So, keep in mind that there are different readiness levels of students, but also of resources. So awareness ready, to know that scientists and engineers exist, to go on a field trip to the museum, to get the simple downloadable one-page kind of worksheet and patch it together, is an awareness ready thing. Knowledge readiness is the kind of thing that we can learn all about science and engineering through textbooks. In performance readiness, we can use the old kits and learn. If you want to know how hard a rock or mineral is, scratch it, and you can figure that out there. Mastery readiness is really looking at skills for answering any problem, answering any question or solving any problem. And so they really transcend the content itself to kind of look over, a much broader context. And an example I like to use is, if you think about scratch tests from rocks and minerals, mastery readiness is really about thinking in a context or having a context like a contractor developing plans for a kitchen or actually building a kitchen, having to decide what countertop to use. And there's lots of different options. And if the countertop needs to be durable, could a student look through a context, ask the right questions, gather data from the questions, or develop a model to develop data to be able to then inform that contractor. So for instance, if there was granite and marble and wood and plastic and all these different materials, would a student who is engaged in helping the contractor solve the problem think about, first and foremost, what is durability? Does it have to do with melting, scratching, fracturing, and so on? Do we have any data on it? What data can we use? What sort of test would we have to do on each of these materials to find out if it melts or if it scratches and so on? If we carry out that test, what does the data actually say? And then what recommendation would you make based on that data? That's mastery readiness. And so oftentimes, and this is an example from one of our middle school units, but the idea of students developing their plan and then using it. Curriculum that does that is really good for this purpose. But you can see scientific process here. There's a plan, and then plan is carried out, and there's reflection back on that in a conclusion. The last bit I'll leave you with, and then I'll take questions. So if you have questions or you want to think of a question, now's a good time to do it. I'll take those in 1 second. Understanding that everyone has expectations. So with these new next generation science standards rolling out, there's going to be curriculum, professional development, materials. It's hard to have one without the other. They all have to meet up. They all have to agree. There needs to be common language, and they have to support teachers in creating that STEM learning environment. Okay, and it really shouldn't be on the teachers, to create that from scratch. What's important, though, is that as we talk about all these shifts that we've talked about with the practices, new, more dynamic content, the idea that students are going to be uncovering sort of how content interacts and having to perform an expectation, not just remember a fact, and develop these skills and show the skills, that the picture of what that STEM learning environment is something that teachers and even parents are going to need help understanding. And that every one of these, teachers or students, parents, even administrators, are a kind of stakeholder group. And one of the most important ways to sort of prevent a showdown is to bring this information to everyone in these stakeholder groups to help them understand, why do we have these new standards? And again, because of the skills and practices, the higher order thinking, engaging students in understanding how, or developing the skills for how science and engineering is developed, or the products of science and engineering occur, not just about the history, which is what is the traditional piece, and for teachers how that instructional model looks, and for learners how to engage appropriately. Because if you don't do that, then you don't have closed loop communication, and what happens is students are going to have one expectation, teachers are going to have another expectation, administrators, after school programs, parents are all going to have different expectations, and that's when things start moving sideways. And without going into it in too much more depth, when issues come up, it's important to sort of isolate and understand whether that's an individual or whether it's that sort of stakeholder group, and then really help educate them. Because that's really another place where the Common Core standards fell short. That education process did not happen appropriately. There was some public awareness, but after that everyone sort of kind of hid, and it was sort of up to everyone on a local level to try and make sense of what they heard from the person just above them, and that was not always maybe the most helpful. So with that in mind, I'll take those questions. I did want to let you know that there are a number of other related webinars available. If you go to info.knowAtom.com/upcoming-events, and a lot of them are on demand. So if you want to take a look at team strategy for next generation science standards, making the most of data, how to be a helpful leader, key differences between standards and curriculum under the next generation science standards, all of those are on demand at this point. This particular webinar will go on demand, and we will follow up with you to give you a link to the video, as well as I will try to get links to the different resources that I have referenced, so that if you're motivated to dive in deeper, you are more than welcome to do that, and you'll have access to it. My information up top here, Francis Vigent, my email address, fvigent@knowatom.com. If telephone's more your thing, or you have questions about specific KnowAtom resources, or if you do go on to download curriculum off of our website, and you have questions or questions about the materials that go with it, we do have materials and curriculum and professional development. You're welcome to forward any of those questions to Mary Ellen or myself, and I can forward that to the appropriate parties. Just on the data side, and I can show you, we've seen by using the next generation science standards and really that early research in the classroom, even in really tough urban environments where 93% low income like this environment, 85% free lunch, on the existing state testing, we've seen the students who have internalized practice skills and also this engage in the sort of next generation inquiry environment produce significant gains over time. And so this one here, we're warning and failing dropped from 45% to 7%. Another environment over here where I believe the height of their gain was about 51 points. They're still trending upward. This is a another community with 72% low income, all public schools, district schools. And another one here where there's only 20% high needs, only 7% low income in this elementary school, but you can see 17, 18 or so point gain, and so on. So the data, even on the ground, when you start to put these practices in place now, if the testing hasn't shifted, students still see benefit, and a lot of it has to do with that higher order thinking. Okay, so on the question side, if anyone has any questions, be happy to take those. Questions related to Common Core, reflected in Next Generation Science Standards. If you have questions about the Next Generation Science Standards specifically, it's all fair game. I'll stick for a few minutes here. As you're doing that, I'll pull up, depending on what state you're from, you may be familiar with pieces like this. So this is one approach. So this is an example from Massachusetts for how science testing links to school accountability. So in Massachusetts, there's a PPI, which is a performance index. And that performance index, each school gets points, and then the district gets points, or sort of an average for kind of the performance of the schools within that district. And what happens is that oftentimes on the testing, there are all these different accountability areas, and oftentimes special populations like high needs, low income, English language learners, students with disabilities, so on, will be given sort of their own category, and then in each of those categories, a school can get points. And so if you're only tested in 4th grade or 5th grade or 8th grade or so on, the testing in that grade level determines the points for that school, especially if it's an elementary school where you maybe stop at grade 5, you only have 4th or 5th grade students being tested, so you get points based on that one test year. Looking forward, the next generation of assessments is likely to be able to yield the same type of data. And so when you think about how, if your state is not currently involving science and its accountability metrics for your school or district, this is a way that it's most likely going to happen by subgroup, and then looking at performance targets. So what you see here in red was the performance target, and in blue was the actual achievement level. And then depending on if the target was met or how close, or if the target was exceeded, you'll see on the right different levels of points that were awarded. And so this is an example from this middle school, which you can see we worked with these folks, and they went from 4% proficient to 23%, and then they've gone up another like 5 or so points here, and you can see that warning failing dramatically dropping. When you look at the school's makeup, you can see 95% low income, 87% free lunch. It's even more severe than the district. The district, as an urban district, is even more severe than the state average. But the way that the school benefits not only by having students who are proficient and advanced, but in an accountability sense, they need to meet all these targets. And so that's something to kind of keep in mind as this all rolls forward. Okay, so I'm going to grab a question here. So there's a question here around processing, and I'm not sure when you ask about processing in New Jersey how what specifically you mean by that. If you mean students actually processing, I can say that the practices and processes for students to be able to develop working understanding and use those in the classroom is not, is not an issue. These standards are the result of research, extensive research on not only, what needs to happen for students, but really models that, show what can happen in terms of what's actually happening in classrooms. What, when we find a classroom that has effective STEM instruction, what are the performance levels of those students? What is it that they, are demonstrating in terms of skills? What ideas do they have sort of the capacity to engage and so on? So it's a result of research and really broad research as well. So some questions around where there are grade-specific standards. And so if there are grade-specific standards and you think about courses, whether you think about a high school course or middle school course or even elementary school, are you supposed to only teach that? And what sort of impact does that have? Well, so this brings up the difference between curriculum and standards. So the standards are really what a student has to have mastered by that grade level, if it's a grade level specific standard. If it's in a range of grades, then you have to have mastered it by the end of the grade range. So if you're from a state that has traditionally had standards that were for kindergarten to second grade, and then grade 3 through 5, and then 6 through 8, and so on, they're kind of tiered. That's an example of a grade range. So the next generation science standards are very focused on specific contexts, and where there are grade level specific standards, they need to be mastered by those grade levels. So they kind of scaffold in that sense. The role of curriculum is to connect the standards and also to take into account the idea that students are going to be entering and exiting your district in potentially any grade level and at any time. And if a child is doing that, if you do or I should say do, but if a standard is taught in only one grade level, if a child misses that grade level because they've come from another community or whatever, then that's a hole. That's a hole in that student's understanding, and it's actually a hole in your curriculum and in your district, because the more students that have that happen, the lower the performance levels of the district, of the schools where it's happening, and also that student, because they have a hole in their understanding, their actual performance drops, right? So, to create curriculum that's just focused on one standard, that's really a traditional model of, try to teach the standard and, master the standard and move on. These standards are highly engineered. They're not really intended to work that way. They're really intended to work as a system where the content interacts, the practices interact, the concepts interact, and in fact the performance expectations are able to be applied in many different contexts. And so their value really gets depth over time. And so as a student sort of goes through evolving contexts from one grade level to the next, or September through June, they're getting a deeper understanding of practices, they're connecting disciplinary core ideas, they're seeing cross-cutting concepts reflected in different areas of content. So, so to teach something only at one grade level is really, it's not a best practice to start with, even under existing standards. And unfortunately, really the lowest performing districts tend to do that. They tend to isolate concepts and try to sort of, explain that, for 3 months at a time, everything about earth science or about rocks and minerals or whatever, and it happens, let's say, in 3rd grade, and then we move on. And we don't see anything about that again, maybe till 6th or 7th grade. And that's a negative under existing standards. And the reason being that students, when they're learning, are basically generating a framework for understanding. One of the expectations of them as a student, but also skills. So when we talk about using precision, you don't just use precision once, you use precision in everything. So the idea that that can be taught once and left alone as a practice is ridiculous. But then the thing is that the ideas of things like physical science, matter, everything is made of matter, states of matter impact our entire world, and in fact it is the foundation for the universe. And sort of thinking about Earth as our home here in the universe, that states of matter and things like the water cycle allow life to exist and actually determine where life can exist here on Earth, and sort of the differences in climates and ecosystems and so on. So if you just sort of think through that context, you can see how earth science, life science, physical science can all be interconnected, and how that can actually scaffold over time and even move forward into physics, and sort of how energy transfer occurs and how energy is transformed, but then how all of these areas can be applied in the context of solving problems as engineers. So that's how engineering, I think a lot of people are concerned about, oh, now there's engineering in the standards. If that's all you're worried about, you're missing the big picture, because engineering is just an application of science to solve problems. It does have a different process than science. There's a scientific process, there's an engineering design process. Similar to, if you think about the difference between practices and processes, you can think about the writing practices as being like word choice, voice, and things like this, and those are the writing practices. The writing process would be something like pre-writing, peer review, and revision, and then publishing, and so on. The actual stages you go through. So I want to. I don't mean to beat this to death, but I want to just make sure that you understand that these standards are not tasks, they're not curriculum, they're actually something the curriculum has to be developed from. And so that's why KnowAtom exists, is that we've been around for 10 years and really following this process, and have gone really all in on it because it's good for kids and it's good for teachers. It's what we all as teachers want to do. We want to inspire children. We want to put them into that role of scientist and engineer. We want them to have the aha moments. And these standards give us the permission to do that. However, if you think you're going to accomplish that with a textbook with different pictures that considers itself next generation, these are polar opposites. So it's important to understand that. And then it's also important to understand that despite where there may be grade level specific standards, it's important that the mastery happens by then, but you're also introducing, reinforcing along with mastering. So standards from prior grade levels are coming up and being reinforced. Standards from future grade levels are being introduced, and that's really part of the art and science of creating great curriculum. And again, doing it, hands-on, at least the way we do, is a real powerful way to do that. But I think that's a really fantastic question. One other question has to do with the next generation assessments and other models. And this will be the last question I take. So I would say look at Ohio. There are inquiry assessments there that are really considering themselves next generation in nature. Another set of assessments I would recommend you look at is the New England Common Assessment Program. That's an assessment that's traditionally been shared between Vermont, New Hampshire, Maine, and Rhode Island, which has an inquiry portion, and I would say focus on the inquiry portion. You can see they have examples of grade 4, grade 8, and grade 10 or 11. In that, you can see how students are exposed to a context. They have to actually use their practice skills and really go through the process as a scientist to consider a context, carry out an experiment, gather data, and then use that data to reflect back on their hypothesis or somebody else's hypothesis as well. The third one I would recommend is international. in nature. So the OECD, the Organization for Economically Cooperating and Economic Cooperation and Development, I think is what it stands for, OECD, and the assessment is PISA, P-I-S-A, and that is more of a test. I believe it's given to 15-year-olds, and because it's international, that basically represents that transition point between middle school and high school, and you can kind of consider it to be at that level. The PISA assessment is another inquiry sort of style assessment, but it's much more of what you would see with something like a PARCC assessment in ELA than what you might expect to see with science, where there's a context, there's data, and then there are different questions asked in relation to the data, in relation to the context, and sometimes it has to do with fictitious people's assumptions, and the student has to debunk the assumption or challenge it or think of an alternative in light of the data, in light of the context. And so I would recommend taking a look at that, the OECD's PISA assessment for science specifically. They give it in other areas, but science specifically. And the next generation of assessments that we can expect for science in NGSS states are going to look and feel an awful lot like those. Could they be hands-on? It's possible. The NECAP assessments, the New England Common Assessment Program, does have hands-on inquiry as part of it in the standardized assessment. Could there be multiple choice components? Certainly, but most likely it's going to be these open response style assessments where students have to gather information from what's been given to them and then synthesize as a result of the information gathered, but also in such a way that they're demonstrating the performance expectation. So I would point you to those three sources. That's all we have time for now. I appreciate you all joining us. Like I said, this recording will be available online, probably 24 to 48 hours. If you do have any questions that unfortunately I couldn't get to, or if you do download any next generation units from KnowAtom.com under the STEM curriculum section and have questions, feel free to reach out to myself or to Mary Ellen. You can also reply to any of the emails that you got, and we will forward you to the right person here at KnowAtom. Thank you again, and have a great day. Bye now.